Hello, I am Sandy Goldberg from the Department of Philosophy at Northwestern University. It is lovely to be with so many people today. Today is Juneteenth, June 19th. We are in honor of the Juneteenth holiday. We are having as our theme the epistemology and in philosophy of race. Just a quick couple of comments on Juneteenth itself. As most of you know, this is a holiday that has been long recognized within the African American community, celebrating the moment when the last slaves in Texas were notified by the Union Army that they had actually been freed. It took place on June 19th, 1865. Interestingly, some 2 months after the official end of the Civil War. It has long been acknowledged within the African American community as a celebration of independence, and it is something that's celebratory. And it's in partial recognition of this and in celebration of this that we hold today's meeting. But in addition, we also hold this meeting because we know that in the United States, and actually throughout the world, but I'll focus on the United States, the vision of justice for all is one that has never been realized in our country. Our country has always treated people of color as second-class citizens, and it's in recognition of the remaining work that needs to be done that we focus on this today as well. I just want to start with two quotes from two athletes who actually, I think, brought a certain understanding of the importance of what's going on today to all of us. And the first is the great basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who remarked that, quote, "Racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible even if you're choking on it until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. As long as we keep shining that light, we have a chance of cleaning it wherever it lands." That was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And then the tennis great Serena Williams recently remarked, "The worst part of this," meaning what's going on right now in the United States, "is nothing new, it's just filmed." And it's in the spirit of recognition of the tremendous work that needs to be done in this country to achieve justice for all, racial justice and social justice, that we have today's event on the theme of epistemology and in philosophy of race. We have three speakers today. They are Lacey Davidson of California Lutheran University, Vanessa Wills of George Washington University, and Charles Mills of the City University of the City of New York. And that will be the order in which they will speak. So I will begin with Lacey Davidson of California Lutheran University. Her presentation is entitled, "What's Wrong with Epistemic Appropriation?" Lacey, it's all yours.
Thank you. And it wouldn't be a philosophy talk without a different title than it used to have. If I can make this go. Okay, sorry, I just did it. So the new title is Epistemic Theft as Epistemic Appropriation. So that's the new title. So thanks to the Social Epistemology Network for hosting this Works in Progress series. And thanks to all of you who have joined yet another Zoom meeting. I come to this work as a white woman committed to anti-racism, who often theorizes about the shit that white people do. So for these reasons, I do not attempt to give unified accounts, but rather to highlight the epistemic patterns that white people and those who embody other dominant identities participate in and uphold. I'm not sure what your Facebook looks like recently, but I've seen this meme or one like it on my timeline. It doesn't take a nuanced analysis to see the obvious flaws in this reasoning. However, I think it is representative of a much larger set of ways of thinking and behaving that I'll call epistemic theft. Epistemic theft occurs when those who embody socially dominant identities, like white people, use the epistemic resources developed by those who embody socially marginalized identities, like Black, Indigenous people of color, to understand their own socially dominant experiences. So the white people use the experiences developed by Black, Indigenous people of color, for example, to understand the white people's experiences. Epistemic theft is committed by those in socially dominant positions in an attempt to show that they too are experiencing oppression. In this talk, I'll situate epistemic theft as a subtype of what Emmeline Davis calls epistemic appropriation. So hence the sort of title change. To understand epistemic appropriation or theft, we must first have an understanding of epistemic resources, which are conceptual tools for understanding the world. Epistemic resources are what is missing when Miranda Fricker's hermeneutical injustice occurs. Here I'm interested in a particular kind of epistemic resource development, the development of epistemic resources by those who are socially marginalized to understand their own experiences of oppression. These are specialized epistemic resources because they are responding to and interconnected with a particular set of social power conditions and a particular location or standpoint within these conditions. For example, Patricia Hill Collins writes, "Living life as Black women requires wisdom because knowledge about the dynamics of intersecting oppressions has been essential to U.S. Black women's survival." Fannie Lou Hamer, a Black Southern organizer, said in a speech, "I've been behind white people and I watched them. See, that's where you made your mistake, white America. You put us behind you and we watched you and now we know you and you don't know us." And Gloria Anzaldúa writes, "La facultad is the capacity to see in surface phenomenon the meaning of deeper realities, to see deep structure below the surface. Those who do not feel psychologically or physically safe in the world are more apt to develop this sense." I select these quotations because they represent accounts of the development of epistemic resources and the particular power contexts that are a part of the resources themselves. In her paper on epistemic appropriation, Emmeline Davis develops a conceptual analysis of epistemic appropriation, of which I'll argue epistemic theft is a subtype. On her account, epistemic appropriation occurs when two conditions are met: detachment and misdirection. Epistemic detachment occurs when epistemic resources developed by those in non-dominant social positions gain, in her words, intercommunal uptake, but they are detached from those who develop them. Epistemic misdirection occurs when those resources are then used to benefit the relatively powerful within a social dynamic. So in other words, dominantly situated knowers receive the benefits of those resources entering into the intercommunal knowledge sphere. A central example in her analysis is Harriet Beecher Stowe's appropriation of the theorizing and stories of Sojourner Truth. Although some of the epistemic resources developed by Truth are able to be shared within dominant knowledge communities, they are detached from Truth, and the material and benefits and epistemic credit are then misdirected to Stowe. So the purpose of this talk is to extend Davis's account to theorize about a subset of epistemic appropriation, which I'll call epistemic theft. So just to note, Davis does use the phrase epistemic theft in her paper, and it's the inspiration for my term, but she doesn't use it in the way that I specifically develop it here. So again, epistemic theft occurs when those who embody socially dominant identities use the epistemic resources developed by those who embody socially marginalized identities to understand their own socially dominant experiences. Epistemic theft often occurs within a landscape of being held accountable for privilege, the content of speech or writing, their racist behaviors, or in response to anti-racist institutional policies. To understand this, we can evoke the familiar adage, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." At its base, epistemic theft results from a lack of understanding or analysis of power. The epistemic thief incorrectly assumes that epistemic resources, like all things, are neutral with respect to social power. This causes them to believe all epistemic resources are for them. In order for epistemic theft to be a subset of Davis's epistemic appropriation, it must meet the conditions of detachment and misdirection. So I think epistemic theft meets both of these conditions. It meets epistemic detachment by detaching the epistemic resource from those who developed it, as well as from the conditions and contexts under which the resource was developed. And it meets epistemic misdirection because epistemic theft occurs solely for the purpose of benefiting those who are already socially powerful. In this way, it's an extremely vicious form of epistemic appropriation because the purpose of introducing the resource is to misdirect it, to attempt to use it and to understand one's dominant position at the expense of understanding the experiences of those who develop the resource to understand their own experiences. So I'm going to highlight two cases here. I think that there are a lot of cases, but these are the ones I will highlight. And this is using epistemic oppression and the term reverse racism. So we know epistemic oppression and racism are concepts that have been developed by those who are marginalized within current social power dynamics to understand their own experiences. As Christy Dotson puts it, epistemic oppression is persistent epistemic exclusion that hinders one's contribution to knowledge production. So we've been hearing, or I've been hearing at least, a lot of people claiming to have been silenced through political correctness, or for in general having their views subject to criticism, or worries that some topics just can't be talked about any longer. They claim that they are the ones who are really being oppressed, unable to share their views in the public domain without being held to account for those views. Similarly, the term reverse racism is a common form of epistemic theft. Claims of reverse racism are that white people are really the ones who experience racism. This is often in response to policies that are meant to address systemic racism, like affirmative action or equity programs in universities, and is also a complaint in response to being called out for their own racism or for benefiting from white privilege. So don't get me wrong, I think that white people in these cases are actually confused. They need epistemic resources to understand their experiences. Sometimes this confusion is genuine, and sometimes it's performative as a way to distance themselves from responsibility. But I wish to highlight that choosing the incorrect epistemic resources through epistemic theft leads to moral and epistemic wrongs. And I hope that diagnosing epistemic theft will allow for the selection or development of fitting epistemic resources, resources that could actually help people to understand their experiences as well as the experiences of others. So we're familiar probably with Christy Dotson and Gail Polhouse Jr., who identify failures to take up epistemic resources as both morally and epistemically problematic. Epistemic appropriation and theft, on the other hand, point out an inverse problem. The problem is the pernicious ways of taking up epistemic resources, appropriating them or thieving them for your own use rather than what they were developed for. So Davis argues that the primary wrong of epistemic appropriation is the violation of a human capability for epistemic contribution. This is the limiting or squashing of epistemic agency through detaching the epistemic contribution from its developer, so the epistemic resource is detached from the person who developed it, and by the misdirection of credit and benefit to those who are already in power. I want to suggest that in the case of epistemic theft, there's an additional epistemic wrong. This additional epistemic wrong arises, as I mentioned, out of the absence of a power analysis. Those who take up these resources without understanding the context and the standpoint from which they were developed fail to understand that power relations are baked into the concepts. There is no power-neutral way to deploy these epistemic resources because they were in fact developed to understand the social power dynamic. So when these resources get detached from the location in which they were developed, and then they're misdirected to benefit the socially powerful, they actually work to obscure the world and make it more likely that the epistemic thief gets the world wrong. In addition to getting the world wrong, it's more likely that they'll perpetuate further harms from misunderstanding the world that they inhabit. So this results in a reinforcement of the epistemology of ignorance as theorized by Charles Mills, in which white people are unable to understand the world they have created. And I think this is partially within our current landscape because they've been epistemic thieves. So my point here is not to argue, again, that there's not anything missing. I think there is something missing from people's understandings. And this resources that are missing is what leads them to be unable to understand their experiences, as well as the experiences of others, or systematic oppressions like racism.
1 minute left.
Thank you. I think there is a way forward. And that's obviously to stop epistemic theft. But it's a little more complicated than that, probably, because people who are engaging in epistemic theft don't necessarily know that they're doing that. So, of course, we have to fight against both contributory and hermeneutical, contributory injustices and hermeneutical ignorance, focusing on the resources that are already developed for understanding experiences. So lots of people in non-dominant identities have given white people lots of resources for understanding white people's experiences. So looking to those resources that are already developed, and then also to develop additional resources as necessary. So again, my hope here is that identifying and diagnosing epistemic theft can be a pathway forward to the appropriate use of epistemic resources, such that we might be able to collectively fight against racism and other oppressions. Thanks so much for having me today, and I'm very honored to be a part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Lacey. Thank you for your presentation. And at this point, I am going to go to Jenny Saul to oversee the Q&A period.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a question from Georgie Gardner. It sounds like this account of epistemic theft limits it to people who don't understand the power structures, but plausibly sometimes epistemic theft can be performed by knowledgeable people on purpose. Example, shrewd and canny management at Fox News. They know about power structures and this helps them to manipulate the narrative. So I wonder whether the account is too narrow in this respect.
Thanks. That's really useful and interesting. I think you're right that a lot of times people know what they're doing. So I guess it should be reframed that it's like either you're ignorant of the power structure and you don't have a power analysis, or like you know that there's a power analysis out there and you refuse to take it up, or like maybe you believe it but you're just super vicious and yeah, and so you're just going to use it to your advantage in this case. So I think you're right that all those things can happen. And I do have in my mind kind of the egregious cases of like Fox News, and I want this to be able to capture it. So maybe it's just about being more specific that it's either an ignorance of a power analysis or the intentional stripping away of that power analysis in order to engage in epistemic theft. Thanks for that great question.
So the next question is from Boaz Miller, who asks, what about intersectional identities? For example, a white woman or a working class white man who are both in privileged and non-privileged positions.
Yeah, good. So I took out some wording to make it under my 10 minutes because I wanted to honor that, but I do think it's with respect to a vector of their social identity. So I think that there are people who have engaged in the resource development with respect to one of their marginalized identities, and then those can be taken up by people who embody a dominant identity with respect to that vector of their social identity. So I think it can handle the complexity, maybe just not in 10 minutes. But I do think that the account in general has the ability to think about particular vectors. And because I focus on racism and anti-racism, I'm usually thinking about that vector, but I think it works. And I think I don't think that this question is trying to cover this over, but I think we have to make sure that we're not epistemically appropriating somebody who embodies a marginalized identity with respect to a particular vector, like a Black woman, if you're like a white person who embodies like a working poor white person, right? So like I think it can still be epistemic theft if it's along a particular social identity. But I also think that this is a good location for shared resources. So in the longer version of the paper, there's this question about like boundary cases where people do use the resources developed by other people kind of by analogy. So I think it's possible, but also needing to be careful, and epistemic theft can occur. Thanks.
Okay, just so everybody knows, I'm going to be using a 1 question per question rule unless we really have a lot of extra time, which we don't. So I'm going to ask Karen Frost Arnold's first question and not her second. I was wondering whether you've thought about the connection between epistemic theft and the concept of recuperation, not something I know much about, but have been needing to read about.
Yeah, I would be the same boat as you. I'm not exactly sure what the concept of recuperation is. So if we were in person, I would ask you to expand on that.
Yeah, okay.
We have time for one more question, Jenny.
One more question. Okay, I'll ask David Enochs. When ideas are used in ways not intended and not foreseen by those coming up with them, this is often good and productive. So I don't see how the emphasis on this phenomenon can be central. I don't see an alternative to going through the details of the relevant idea, and the questions just disappeared. Okay, and seeing whether it in fact applies in the new circumstances in which it's being applied, and of course many times it won't, but sometimes it may.
Yeah, so I think you're right that lots of times people develop resources and then they get used in ways that they didn't intend. And in some ways, once a concept is out there, you know, there might be some theory where that idea kind of belongs to the people. But I think in this case, there is something particularly pernicious going on because it serves to cover over the world, to reinforce ignorance. And as with the first question, sometimes people do know what they're doing. They know that in engaging what I would call epistemic theft, they are going kind of out of their way to cover over the reality of the situation. So I
Lacey,
guess,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I guess I think it seems like this person thinks that this is not a good thing to focus on. And I guess I just disagree with them.
So Lacey, thank you very much for that. I do want to draw your attention to the fact that we have at least 4 other questions in the Q&A. These are always posted afterwards, so I would encourage you to have a look at those so that you can know what kind of questions people had for you. And thank you very much for your presentation. At this point, we're going to go to our second presentation. This is by Vanessa Wills of George Washington University, and her presentation is entitled, "What Should We Know About Race?" Vanessa, it's all yours.
Okay, great. I trust everyone can hear me just fine. Thank you so much for having me. So I know this is a work in progress series, and I intend to take that very seriously. And so what I'm going to do today is a kind of a hybrid sort of thing. So I'm going to both present some material from a paper that's forthcoming about race and false consciousness. But what I want to do in this space with this time is to present the sort of basic line of argument of that paper, and then talk about a problem, a kind of, or a set of problems that is given to us by the claims I make in the paper, and to think speculatively for now, and with your help in the Q&A, about ways to push that analysis forward. Okay, I'm just going to get into it since we have 10 minutes. As I say in the abstract for this talk, right, one hallmark of the marginalization that some groups of people are relegated to the status of objects, right, essentially of things that are known about, and they are excluded from recognition as knowers, right? So agents who actually perform inquiry and have critical analyses of the world. And the question that's animating the talk, or the kind of themes that I'm presenting today, is, well, how does the struggle for epistemic recognition as knowers, echo, reinforce, and advance the struggle for political recognition, right? So recognition more broadly as human beings, and recognition as agents, and as people who have a right to wield power in a certain way in order to make the world one in which they can flourish. And of course, with special attention to the question of, why do claims of objective validity matter in critical philosophy of race? Just to, again, sort of touch on a broader question, this line of inquiry that I'm engaging in, it comes out of a broader debate about how do we think about the claims that marginalized people, oppressed people make about the world, right? Are they claims that are made within the same kind of valence of claims to universality and objectivity as claims that are made by dominant forces of knowledge production? Are they kind of rivals for recognition and acknowledgement as knowledge claims as such? Or should we do something a bit more radical in a certain way, which is to say, well, these claims, we're not even going to present them to be subjected to this kind of analysis of objectivity and universality, and we're just going to say that we're doing a kind of rival epistemology and rival knowledge. I'm very committed to the idea that what we want is to hold on to these values of objectivity, universality, and rationality, and contest them. So one of the things that I look to for inspiration in this is actually a claim that Mari Matsuda makes in her 1990 Pragmatism Modified in the False Consciousness Problem. And there she writes, "The powerless have always relied on claims of objective truth and on the existing structures of knowledge to critique dominant society on its own terms." Now that by itself doesn't mean that that's the right strategy, but there's a long tradition of resistance theory insisting on its place, right, as a contender for the capacity to make objective, universal claims about what the world is truly like. So, okay, I want to pivot straight into presenting some thoughts about false consciousness. So, false consciousness, of course, is a rather fraught term. And it's one that makes people really nervous and upset usually because it gets associated with this idea of a kind of paternalism, right? I can say more about this in Q&A, but what I want to do is just tell you a bit about how I am presenting a kind of reconstruction of the false consciousness concept. Ideally, I want it to be a concept that one can use and deploy without having to accept the whole Marxist framework, although of course I would love it if you all accepted the whole Marxist framework. But the idea here is that you can actually get at it with some pretty, widely plausible claims about whether or not there is a genuine fact of the matter about what the world is like, right? Okay, so false consciousness, I'm using it as a term of art to describe a process of belief formation that routinely and systematically mistakes a partial and obscured, maybe even heavily stage managed perspective for a kind of freely and autonomously produced view from nowhere, right? Thereby, in turn, reinforcing and lending theoretical justification to the same material conditions that led to the production of the flawed belief. So in that way, right, of course, the concept itself, or as a historical fact about it, is rooted in a Marxist historical materialist analysis of how human beings form their ideas about the world. So one of the things that makes false consciousness so stubborn to dislodge is that it actually does truly, I've got my scare quotes here, it does truly describe the world at the level of superficial appearance. So evidence to support falsely conscious beliefs is everywhere to be found. And it allows the falsely conscious agent to consider themselves pretty reasonably epistemically responsible, while they fail to recognize that the world around them is arranged in such a way, right, precisely to produce the racist beliefs, as well as their misled confidence in the objectivity and correctness of the beliefs. So false consciousness is true in the sense of reflecting certain stable systemic features of the world, albeit in a partial or superficial way. So in that respect, my account of false consciousness is indebted to the work of Lukács, who writes in his History and Class Consciousness the following. So Lukács writes, "The dialectical method does not permit us simply to proclaim the falseness of this consciousness and to persist in an inflexible confrontation of true and false. On the contrary, it requires us to investigate this false consciousness concretely as an aspect of the historical totality and as a stage in the historical process." So that's from Lukács. So again, right, a chief danger of false consciousness is that in accepting this false or superficial truth, you have to be willing to let me get a little spooky about this, right? So I'm talking about the idea of a false truth. In false consciousness, we accept a false truth and we mistake it for a kind of deep truth, or you can say, if you're willing to get really spooky, a true truth, right? And we risk reifying and reinforcing the false reality that false consciousness reflects, right? So then the challenge is to interrogate the contents of false consciousness so as to ascertain their connections to the circumstances that give rise to them, and to discover what they reveal about the historical moment from which they emerge. So I introduce a distinction between what I call first order false consciousness and second order false consciousness. So first order false consciousness is false beliefs about the world, and second order false consciousness is false beliefs specifically about the subject's own processes of belief formation, which of course is part of the world, right? But for analytical purposes, we want to hold that separate and think about that in isolation. So first order false consciousness, which occurs in the case of false beliefs about, first order false consciousness occurs in the case of false beliefs about the world that are sustained and at least superficially justified by objective social arrangements. And second order false consciousness occurs in the case of false beliefs about how one came to hold the beliefs that one does. And I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, right? So lots of things are examples of false consciousness. One of those things is racist ideology, right? So racist ideology is a form of false consciousness. Insofar as all false consciousness is produced by and reflects, however imperfectly, the real life process of human beings, false consciousness is no exception. So some examples of this, right? If you want the evidence of the false truth that Black lives don't matter, for example, right? It's everywhere. Black people are paid less for the work they do. Black people are killed. Their lives are pretty cheap in this society. Black people it takes very little, right, for a Black person to be considered irredeemable, right, not worth the effort, right? And so these things they're facts about the social world within which we all operate. And that means that when an individual person has the belief, whether it's the explicit or implicit belief, or has the kind of affective orientation, right, that matches a low value for Black people, it's not obviously just some kind of individual mistake. It's that too, right? But they are accurately reflecting a real fact about the social world, right? And so that is importantly, one of the main things that makes false consciousness something particular and distinct. There's lots of ways of being wrong. I can think, at one point, I thought that this session began at 1:30 Eastern, for example, just an hour and a half ago. I was wrong. There's lots of philosophically interesting stuff in there, right, about what I'm wrong, but there's no like objective sense reflected out there in the world in which this session in fact starts at 1:30 Eastern. I was just wrong. I made a mistake. And that's different, right? It's for if we think about the case of women, for example, right? If somebody thinks that women's lives matter less, there's all kinds of objective facts about the social world within which we operate that supports and gives, heft, right, to that belief, and that explains how the belief comes about. Okay, how am I on time right now? I want to make sure
You got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, I can do that. All right, I'm gonna throw in one of my favorite Marx quotes because, whatever, it's my talk, I can do that. I just want to make sure to say this following thing, right? So one thing that folks often think about Marxist analyses is that Marxist and Marxist theory doesn't have a way of thinking about the efficacy of ideas in the world, right? But in fact, right, here's a line that I come back to often in Marx. So he says, the weapon of criticism cannot replace criticism by weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. So movement slogans such as Black Lives Matter, I am a man, right, and others are conceptual interventions made in the context of building mass power, and they constitute attempts to realize theory as a material force. The maintenance of racist ideology requires not only the ability to disseminate racist propaganda through the news media, the academy, the pulpit, right, and anywhere one can disseminate it from, it also requires the ability to produce the concrete structures that instantiate and provide evidentiary support for stereotypes and negative attitudes regarding racially oppressed groups. So to dismantle racist ideology requires movements that craft theoretical interventions highlighting the inessentiality and contingency of the despised racial group's oppressed status, as well as practical interventions aimed at directly undermining the oppressive conditions that are reflected in racist beliefs about the naturalness or appropriateness of these groups' degraded status. So the question that comes out of this, or one of the many questions that comes out of this, is I don't cast this in terms of subject and object, but that's the direction that I'm pushing in terms of thinking more about this this conceptual framework, right? So politically, what's called for is a kind of new political subject, right? This kind of what's one of the things that is made possible, right, by the attempts of the marginalized and oppressed to liberate themselves and to challenge, right, these kinds of ideological structures that reflect and reinforce their oppression, they need to create new conditions, right? And so in attempting to alter the society, one of the things is, of course, to alter themselves, to alter their own capacity to organize with one another and to develop theories about the world, but also to create new conditions and therefore new knowers within the dominant groups, right? And so this attempt to kind of extend their agency and their power, right, not just within their own way of theorizing and cognizing the world, but also through this direct intervention into the circumstances in which we all operate, to also alter the conditions within which people in dominant groups are formed as knowers. And so that's the direction I'm moving in and thinking about, how do we overcome this kind of, like static, abstract opposition of, subjective partial perspective and objective universal perspective. It's going to have to be a kind of political project of remaking the subject, right? And so, okay, I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Appreciate it. And so now I pass on to Jenny Saul for the Q&A period.
Was muted. Okay. So we have a question from Anna Sarah Malgren. She says it's a clarification question, and she starts by saying, super interesting talk, but what are false truths in non-spooky terms? And is there a particular reason for using the spooky terms? Are they apparent truths or false beliefs?
Yeah. So what I'm capturing, and I'm following a kind of tradition of thinking. You see this kind of language in Marcuse, you see it in Lukács, as I noted, and the purpose is to put tension on this kind of abstract separation of true and false, right? Because what's wrong with with the ideas of false consciousness, right, is not, so take something like Black Lives Matter. That's actually thinking about that slogan is actually what got me in, kind of into this question. Why does that phrase, less so now, right, but a few weeks ago even, right, why does that phrase strike so many as absurd and affront, right? As sort of misleading and wrong in some way. There's lots of reasons for this, right? But I submit that one of them is that it's obviously false in a certain way, right? It's not, it is an insurrectionary claim, precisely because it confronts, challenges, and denies, right, the existence of an order in which Black lives don't matter, and so so using this language of a true falsehood, right? Of course, we can eliminate the language, right? But part of the reason that I use it is because I want to push us, right, into thinking about the ways in which these things that we, morally speaking, recognize as falsehoods, right, in fact, do have this kind of real bounded legitimacy as descriptions of the social world within which we operate. And so we need to attend to that. In order to be able to make the knowledge claim, right, make the true claim in a way that isn't just a kind of merely ethical, expression of faith, right, but to make it the case that these actually describe the world that we want. That's what we want, is a world that matches that description of Black Lives Mattering.
Okay, the next question is from Daniel Singer, which is in the chat box because that's where panelists can put their questions. He writes, interesting project. Part of the motivation for your talk was that there's some connection between being treated as a knower and being treated as a full political participant in society. This strikes me as broadly right, but I'm worried about a potential counterexample. It seems like sophisticated computers or robots can be knowers, but it doesn't seem like we should be worried about political representation or participation for those. This motivates thinking that being a knower is an interesting epistemic category at best rather than a political category. What do you think?
Oh yeah. So there's a kind of question in a lot of Marxist thought, that is kind of subterranean in a way, and it comes from the humanism of Marx's perspective, right? And this kind of absolute insistence on these categories of species being and human nature, although that's fraught and contended, right? What work that's doing for Marx. I read Marx as very, very humanist, right? And so you can generate the question with respect to computers or robots or aliens from another planet. Well, how would they figure into this, and if they don't, why wouldn't they? I think it depends on the computer. It depends on how sophisticated the computer. I mean, if the computer is involved in our practices of producing and reproducing the world and transforming it. I mean, I think in a certain way is a kind of contingent question. Now, that's one side of the question. The other side is knowing enough, and no, right? So or the connection here between subjectivity as a knower and subjectivity as a political agent is that, in fact, I think they're the same thing, actually. So I think that in order that the practice of knowing the world and the practice of changing it are ultimately the same. And so if this is the sort of computer that joins the revolution, then come on board, right? But if we're imagining just a kind of passive receptacle of propositions, that's not going to be the right kind of thing for my project. Yeah.
Jenny, we have time for one more question, even though we have, I think, 4 questions there.
Okay, I'll go with Mary McCormick's, who asks, can you say a little more about second-order false consciousness? Mm-hmm. It seems we rarely have access to the correct processes or causes that lead to our beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, I'm not sure what access to correct means there, because well, so I'll just say more about second order false consciousness. So second order false, so the phrase false consciousness first appears in a letter that Friedrich Engels writes, and there he's talking about he thinks that intellectuals in particular have a tendency to think that the beliefs that they have are the result of just, pure reason and contemplation. It's because it's my status as a kind of spontaneous, disembodied mind, right, that gives me access to knowledge about the world. And what Engels is doing with the concept there is pushing back against this and saying, no, of course, everything that we believe is in the final instance, right, in order to explain why we believe it, we're going to have to include in the description some facts about the world within which we operate, right? And so my designation of second order false consciousness, that is more or less the thing that Engels means when he says false consciousness, and so the reason why I said I'm not sure what the type of access is here, right? So it is, the idea is that we're just wrong about how we come by our beliefs, and because we're wrong sometimes about how we come by our beliefs, we have an unjustified confidence in them. One example I give in this paper is, if you ask a racist, why do you think that Black people, are less valuable? He's going to say, well, I've seen them around and they're terrible and blah, 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 right? He probably will not, right, cite all kinds of things like the effectiveness of propaganda, or like, the transatlantic slave trade and the need for an ideology that justify, right? He's not gonna cite any of those things, even though they obviously are part of the picture. And so, yeah, it's that kind of overconfidence about the objectivity and lack of partiality of our beliefs. That's what second order false consciousness pertains to.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, both for your presentation and also for your engaging with the questions during Q&A. I want to say the same thing to you that I said to Lacey, and that is there are at least 3 questions we didn't get to in the Q&A. Those always are, as you know, taken down for posterity's sake, so I encourage you to have a look at them as well. Okay. And now we move to our third and final speaker today. That is Charles Mills. I'm going to ask Charles to unmute himself. Charles is from the City University of the City of New York, and his presentation is entitled The White Problem, American Sociology and Epistemic Injustice. Charles, it's all yours.
Okay, so thanks first of all to Sandy for the invitation, and congratulations on the initiative. I think it's a great one, very timely. As we know, we have to thank President Trump for publicizing June. Nobody knew about it before, so you know, he's doing some good things up there in the White House between golf games. Okay, so work currently in progress is in a somewhat different area. So I thought I would present an actually already completed paper, but your comments, criticisms, and suggestions would still be valuable insofar as it's part of a larger racial justice project. Okay, so this essay is going to be appearing in my former colleague Jennifer Lacey and Lauren Layden Hardy's forthcoming edited collection. So it'll be the Oxford Handbook of Applied Epistemology. So it's a more applied piece. And the aim in the paper is to follow up on some of Elizabeth Anderson's suggestions in a 2012 essay she did for social epistemology, Epistemic Justice as a Virtue of Social Institutions. So sort of taking the focus, you know, off the individual level and expanding the range of the concept of epistemic injustice. So I'm suggesting that we think of the academy as one such institution, and in fact, a particularly appropriate example, since of course, it is itself primarily defined in terms of its epistemic function, that is the search for new knowledge. Sorry, and for those of you who know my work, I think it's in both political philosophy and epistemology. I think it's more illuminating to work within a non-ideal framework. So I think that that's a more illuminating way to approach these issues. So the question we ask then is, how do such institutions function in oppressive societies? Not a rose, an ideal, well-ordered society, but an oppressive society, what I've called in my book with Carol Pateman, an ill-ordered one. So how is the quest for knowledge possibly affected under such circumstances? And my example, sort of, you know, the applied example is American sociology. And the history of the discipline, whose, you know, famous boast, you know, going back to Auguste Comte, is that it's aspiring to give us a science of society. So I draw on the concept, so this in a sense follows nicely from Vanessa's piece, because I too draw on the concept of ideology, classically associated with Marxism, and thus, as you know, out of fashion for decades, displaced in the radical academy by Foucault and post-structuralism, but recently undergoing something of a revival in the analytic tradition, big conference at Yale, few years ago, and an anthology coming out of that conference should be out another year or so. So people sort of using ideology and detaching it from some of the somewhat antiquated Marxist assumptions and applying it to all kinds of other things. So the question then is, and again, sort of linking up with Vanessa, if we frame racism as an ideology, there are different ways of looking at racism. There are different analyses in the secondary literature, and there's approaches that, you know, such as classically Jorge Garcia, that approach racism from the perspective of affect and volition and ill will. And then on the other hand, there are approaches like Thomas Shelby's, which is one I favor myself, to approach it from a cognitivist, doxastic point of view. So if we frame racism as an ideology, a set of belief claims, a way of sort of approaching the world cognitively, and one of the most influential ideologies in modernity, particularly in the United States, how would we expect it to shape American sociology as a discipline in its birth? So would it lead, and this is what I'm saying, that it does do, would it lead to a variety of epistemic injustice that in a sense transcends, Miranda's original categories, the testimonial and hermeneutical, in that it's at a much more macro level, it's epistemic injustice I'm suggesting at the disciplinary level. And as resource material, I use two books that both won American Sociological Association prizes for anti-racist scholarship. My colleague at Queen's University, Stephen Steinberg, sociologist, and this is 1995 book, Turning Back, The Retreat from Racial Justice in American Thought and Policy, which though it's 25 years old, is still very relevant, especially in the current period. And a more recent work, my former colleague at Northwestern, Aldon Morris, this is a 2015 book on Du Bois, The Scholar Denied, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Birth of Modern Sociology. So my title, The White Problem, is a reference to a famous phrase which you can find in the opening chapter of Du Bois's first essay in The Souls of Black Folk, his most famous book. How does it feel to be a problem? And the idea is that you now have a situation where, because of the result of the Civil War, because of the 13th, 4th, and 5th Amendments, you no longer have an enslaved Black population, but it's not the case that these guys are integrated into the polity, into society as equals. So there's a famous question, how does it feel to be a problem, the Negro problem? And this phrase, in fact, becomes so entrenched that in what is one of the most influential books on race in America in the 20th century, Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, written not by an American, but by a Swedish social theorist, it's there in this subtitle. It is, what is it again? Oh yes, An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. And I, of course, an progressive Black theorist, going back 100 years or possibly more, basically argued it's not a Negro problem, it's a white problem. So in terms of the structure of the paper is divided into 3 sections. And as I say, it's available. If anybody's interested, I can happily send it to you. It's in Word now. It's not actually been in the published form yet. So in the first part of the paper, I try to relate ideology to epistemic injustice. And here I'm drawing on an earlier paper I did for the big anthology that was produced by Jose Medina, Gail Polhouse, and others. And I was basically arguing that this concept, now resurrected, sort of is useful for us to sort of entering into the epistemic injustice debates insofar as they're insights of the Marxist tradition, which if you detach the concept of ideology from some of the clearly antiquated and problematic assumptions in Marx and Engels themselves, can be valuable for us. And I reference sort of classic Marxist texts, I've been around that long, it's a bad sign, from the 1970s, ideology in social science, ideology in natural sciences, because the whole point of the Marxist concept was that ideology as a sort of set of ideas, values, frameworks, did not just sort of affect people at the mass level in terms of popular consciousness, it affected the disciplines themselves. So that Marx's own work in Capital, for example, a lot of the time is engaged in this polemical battle against what he calls the vulgar economists, because he thinks that they're approaching the subject of subject of economics wrongly. You need to take a political economy approach, and this was sort of taken up late 19th, early 20th century, and in the sort of mini boom of left theory back in the 70s and 80s, to sort of look at particular disciplines, sort of see how they were shaped by ideology. So then the second section, and of course this can be done from a number of different perspectives, from a gender perspective, from a post-colonial perspective, and so forth. So in the second section, I look specifically at racism as an ideology. And my key text here is Thomas Shelby, because Tom has done a lot of work, on the one hand, drawn from the critical theory tradition, where ideology has been central, but then translating it into the language of analytic philosophy and saying, well, here's how to think of ideology from the perspective of the Anglo-American tradition and to make it respectable by those norms. And then in the final section, the third section, I say, okay, so we have racism as an ideology, the implications for epistemic injustice. let's now look at the development of American sociology, late 19th century, early 20th century. And I make 6 points, as I say, drawn primarily on the texts, from Steinberg and from Aldon Morris. So first of all, Miranda's concept of shared hermeneutical resources. And what I point out is that, in the birth of an academic discipline, you're not starting ex nihilo, you're not starting from zero, you're drawing on ideas that are already present in the culture. And in the mid-19th century United States, late 19th, early 20th century United States, racism is a central part of the culture. And they're competing views on racist ideology. There's a view that humankind had multiple origins. And there's a very influential book, 1854, Types of Humankind or something, by Knott and Glidden, that Stephen Jay Gould, in his very important book, The Mismeasure of Man, gives a detailed analysis of. And the idea is they're separate creations for the human race. That's why blacks are so different. That's why blacks are like gorillas and chimpanzees. And you can find this text online. It's filled with all kinds of great illustrations. Gorilla, chimpanzee, black guys. And you can see how close to black guys look to the two of them. So polygenesis, multiple origins for humanity, that has its influence, but it's basically displaced with the Darwinian revolution. So that post-1859, post the origin of species, the dominant forms of racism then assume a single origin for humanity, and you then have to sort of work racism into that framework. And the key way to do it, most influential way, late 19th century, early 20th century, is social Darwinism. So the idea then being that some races are less evolved than others, some races are closer to the apes than others. So even if we do have a common, origin, by contrast with the claims of, polygenists, nonetheless, some peoples are clearly backward as compared with others. So you have social Darwinism as a sort of key component in the American intellectual atmosphere. And to repeat, it's not the case that this is a belief held by fringe figures. Well, it's held by them as well. But this is being taught at the Ivy League institutions, the most sort of prestigious universities in the country. So then a person seen as the founder of American sociology, a guy called Robert Park, and the Chicago School, was the University of Chicago. Morris's claim is that Park was a social Darwinist, and that people writing about him tend to deny this. But Morris claims that the evidence is there, he's a social Darwinist. That American sociology is sort of shaped in its origins by social Darwinist assumptions, which are predicated on this natural racial hierarchy, and some humans, blacks in particular, being closer to the apes than others. I then look in terms of the sort of broad idea of hermeneutical resources as what you would think of as neighboring disciplines. Because racism as an ideology is not cabined, it's not siloed, because it's basically making claims about humanity. So insofar as the social sciences and some of the natural sciences are studying human beings, then the implications of a natural differentiation within the ranks of humanity is inevitably going to spread across all of them. So for example, in anthropology, which is sort of intimately linked with the colonial enterprise, you have a whole set of literature in the 19th century and so on. We were encountering these new peoples in the European expeditions of discovery or conquest. Where do they fit? Well, clearly there's a natural hierarchy of human beings with whites on the top. Criminology, again, you have the concept in the 19th century of a criminal race. So famous Italian criminal anthropologists, there was this thing called criminal anthropology. And the idea is some races were born criminal. And surprise, surprise, it turns out that the US blacks were sort of an excellent example of that. Political science manifests itself again in a view of the polity as being shaped by the more civilized. And there's the ideology of racial Anglo-Saxonism. And the idea is that whites in general are superior, but within the white race, Anglo-Saxons are the sort of most superior of all. So there's an intra-white racial hierarchy. It's not that whites are a monolith. Some whites are more advanced than others. And even international relations, which might say, well, what does that have to do with race? Well, in the period, early 20th century, you have a situation where, you have white elites saying, we're a minority in the planet as a whole. We need to sort of work out ways to make sure that this situation does not shift against us, given that the majority of the Earth's population are people of color. So the neighboring disciplines, those that are sort of, surround sociology, they're also affected by these race assumptions. Section 3, crucial point made by the left tradition, going back to Marxism, these ideas are linked with material structures. So again, drawn from Thomas Shelby's work, questions then, what are these material structures? Well, I mean, it's not hard to see in the US, racial slavery. You can't have racial slavery in a country that's sort of committed to the equality of all people, unless you have an ideology that says blacks are in a different category. So that's why it's possible for Jefferson, in the opening sentence of the Declaration of Independence, to say we hold these truths of self-evident, all men are created equal, while at the same time being a slave owner. And of course, most of the people who signed, onto the Declaration were in fact slave owners. So, you need an ideology to sort of justify racial slavery, and then subsequent, Jim Crow, so that you can sort of tie ideology as a set of ideas to economic structures and economic advantage and disadvantage. Then, going on again, drawn from Anderson's work, so it's section 4, what chances are there for cognizers from subordinated groups to have cognitive input to give a sort of conflicting perspective on this dominant ideological framework? And Steinberg here is very useful in pointing out the sort of huge obstacles there would have been to Black students in the time, as I say, late 19th, early 20th centuries, to get a good education. In some segregated schools in the South, the ratio of resources going to white and Black schools was as high as 10-to-1. So you have to overcome that. You have to be able to get into a decent institution for a decent undergrad degree. And then, what are the chances of being able to go on to an elite institution for your graduate degree? So you have this startling statistic that as late as the, I think, 1970s, Steinberg quotes, the percentage of sociologists who were Black was 1%. So it's somewhat like where Black philosophers are in philosophy now. So the mainstream of the tradition is overwhelmingly white. It's shaped by these race assumptions. So what kind of sociology do you get? Well, very much not a sociology that says, the United States is basically founded on, racial domination and subordination. Then section 5, I use W.E.B. Du Bois as an example. Here's this sort of leading intellectual figure of Black America, impeccable academic credentials even by white standards, PhD from Harvard, 2 years at what was then called University of Berlin. I think it's now Humboldt, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter all the art. It doesn't matter all the books. He's not going to be getting a job at a white institution. The kind of analysis he's giving of the United States in what Morris calls his sort of competing Atlanta school. So Robert Park is a Chicago school, University of Chicago. Du Bois is working at a more humble institution, Atlanta University, the Atlanta School. They're given a more realistic picture of the problems of race. It doesn't matter. They're sort of ruled out a priori because of the fact that sociology as a discipline is so foundational, shaped by these race assumptions. And then finally, what are the implications for US sociology as a discipline? And Steinberg points out that when the ghetto uprisings begin in the 60s, American sociologists are basically completely at a loss because they don't have the intellectual apparatus, they don't have the concept, they don't have the frameworks to understand this. It just challenges their entire understanding of the United States. So there's a kind of blowback. You sort of keep people of color out, you keep people with more radical analysis out, and this benefits you in some sense insofar as you're the ones getting these jobs, but the discipline as a whole suffers. It's then intellectually handicapped in understanding the world around it. So I suggest that we need to expand the sort of varieties of epistemic injustice there are, and to sort of explore the possibility with respect to race, respect to gender and other things, that you can have a sort of deep contamination of foundational assumptions of frameworks at the disciplinary level. And insofar as these are the prestigious subsets of what Miranda called society's intellectual resources, obviously this has very deleterious and harmful effects for social cognition in the society as a whole and the quest for knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charles, for that really stimulating presentation. I'm going to pass on now to Jenny Saul for the Q&A, and I remind everyone that if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, Jenny, I'm passing on to you.
I want to say also that panelists should put their questions in the chat box because panelists cannot use the Q&A feature, which is just a quirk of Zoom. I think I'll wait a minute here to let people type their questions in because sometimes it takes a little while for them to appear. Okay, so we've got Gianluca Andresani asks, what would be the role of the sociology of knowledge in your view?
Morris himself draws on it. So he's both studying the development of American sociology and saying that you can do a sociology of knowledge of American sociology. So you get these sort of reflexive relations, meta-relations, where you're using the sociology of knowledge to study the development of sociology itself. And you can then get a very illuminating analysis. Well, in a sense, it's sort of quite straightforward. You have people socialized into racist assumptions. These are the ones who are predominantly going to be, staffing universities in the period. It's not going to be surprising that the sociology you get out of that, that kind of community, that epistemic population is going to be deeply flawed.
Okay, Kelly Barr asks, how do you characterize disciplines? What binds them together? Is it precisely the foundational assumptions, the deep historical legacies that you're describing?
Well, I wasn't working with any particularly sophisticated analysis. I was just sort of taking for granted the existing disciplinary boundaries as we recognize them, as they're taught now in sociology, political science, et cetera, et cetera. So there are definitions in terms of subject matter, distinctive approaches, et cetera.
So I've got a question from Sandy Goldberg, who says, great talk, Charles. I'd love to hear you reflect on the development of the discipline of philosophy as well. I'd love to hear about the parallels with the claims you've developed for sociology and any disanalogies, if there are any.
Yes, for years, people have recommended to me a huge book. So, once they told me that, I thought, well, this is not going to happen. It's a huge book by a guy, I think, called Randall Garrett. And its title is very much something like that, Sociology of Philosophy. It came out about 20 years or so ago. And he apparently does, in fact, go into this question of why does philosophy develop in a certain way? How does that account for its features? So as I say, this book is as yet unread by me, as so many others are. But there are all kinds of interesting things you can do. More recently, a book I have read, a guy who was at Northwestern many years ago, a philosopher called John Macomber, then moved to UCLA. And this was maybe 20 years ago, Time in the Ditch. And he was focusing specifically on post-war philosophy. And he was arguing that we need to take account of the impact of McCarthyism in how post-war philosophy develops. And he was saying that if you look at, the interwar years, look at the 30s and, well, the interwar to the 40s, you think of John Dewey and what a central figure he was in American philosophy. And this is by definition, in Dewey's conception of things, philosophy as sort of practically engaged with social problems, not an ivory tower enterprise, right down there on the ground, dialogue with the public, trying to sort of solve things. And then in the 50s, according to Macomber's reading, under McCarthyism, guess which discipline on a per capita basis suffered the highest losses in terms of dismissals from their job? Surprise, surprise, it was philosophy. We're smaller than places like political science and so forth, but on a per capita basis, the heaviest hit was taken by philosophy, precisely because at its best, the pretensions of philosophy, as I don't have to tell you guys, are to be able to put everything into question. Under McCarthy, this is not a good idea. We're putting everything into question. Otherwise, you might have people knocking at your door at 2 o'clock in the morning. So he claims that there's basically a run for cover. And the place you run is into a sort of timeless analytic discussion of things, which is depoliticized. So his analysis, which you could say is certainly not as true now, is that analytic philosophy then becomes a refuge, because that way you can be sure you will not be accused of any sort of putting forward subversive propositions. And it's really only within the 60s, which then leads up in the 70s, that you then begin to get with the shadow of McCarthyism lifted, and the radical 60s, and then folks, even in philosophers, we know, asking all kinds of radical questions. So you could do a kind of sociology of philosophy, that short time period. And in terms of the longer time period, actually, I could also mention Ann Codd's book. I think it's a very, very revealing book, Analyzing Oppression. And what Ann points out in her introduction is that so far as she knows, this is the very first text in mainstream philosophy to be tackling the subject of oppression itself. If you think about it, guys, that's a terrible indictment of the profession. Because insofar as going back to ancient Athens, we're supposed to be the justice and truth guys, then you'd figure social oppression, a sort of fundamental violation of justice, with sort of corollary effects in terms of the regimes of truth. We should have been sort of upfront in the vanguard analyzing this. And Anne suggests you really have to look at the demographic basis of the profession. In pre-modern period, very heavily male, class privileged as well, and then depending on when you see race emerging, some people say race comes in existence in the modern period, then very sort of, racial exclusionary as well. And of course, that's still true today. So it's by no means the case that you cannot have progressive men, progressive whites, and so forth, but it's unsurprising from a theory point of view that people are privileged by systems have less motivation to sort of inquire into these systems, which is why after 2,500 years, you only get a systematic inquiry into gender injustice really with the 70s. I mean, the occasional first wave feminist figures, it's really only with the influx of women to the profession itself, you begin to get this as a topic. 2,500 years of guys, it's not the case that they were out in the wilderness without wives. They had wives right there, they had sisters, they had mothers. Gender injustice, it never occurred to them. So I'm afraid the demography of the profession has to be seen as a major factor.
Great. I've got a question from Sally Haslanger. Who says, I'm surprised that you're so enthusiastic about Shelby's conception of racism, since it seems rather idealistic in the Marxian sense, whereas you've always been materialist. Have you changed your mind, or did I misunderstand your earlier views?
Okay, so I guess, Sally, I saw Tommy's view, and of course, I know you have that critique of him, which, through confession time, I have not yet read. When you sent it to me, I thought of Tommy as linking the ideation to the material insofar as he's saying material base in terms of group interest, in terms of group power, for these ideas to be dominant is in fact there in terms of group interest, sort of in a class dynamics, class interests. So I guess I didn't see it as materialist, as non-materialist in that sense.
Okay,
but
so
to see her.
Karen Frost-Arnold writes, thinking back to some of the questions that Anderson raises about institutions and epistemic injustice, I'm wondering what you think might be the most effective structural interventions to make in the academy, in sociology or philosophy, to undermine the kind of white ignorance that you're describing in disciplines.
Well, it sort of goes back to what most of us, at least those of us with some more power, and of course, a lot of people in society don't have that much power, trying to make the academy more representative, more diverse. And of course, for philosophy in particular, this is the worst time, since the humanities are being underfunded, since jobs are drying up. You really have to be pretty brave. I'm surprised how many brave people are still out there applying. At CUNY, we got like 250 applications. I thought, what do these people think they're going to get if they get into? But perhaps I should not say that publicly. Anyway, yeah, so it's a bad time to be doing this stuff. It's a bad time to be trying to diversify the profession, but that's what you have to do. But it can't be just at that level, because of course there's a power relation insofar as, particularly in these hard times, to be credentialed appropriately, what are you going to do? You're not going to sort of challenge the people who are teaching you. They're the ones who are socializing into the appropriate way to do things. And in many cases, they will have this worldview themselves. So it can't just be the thought, we bring in a lot of women and people of color, and that will change things automatically. No, it won't. You also have to challenge the existing paradigms, the existing frameworks, sort of ways of doing theory, Otherwise, people just make sure they continue to reproduce themselves by, turning out, people in their image.
I'm afraid we are just about out of time. So I just want to take the opportunity, Charles, to thank you so much, both for a really lovely presentation and also for engaging so thoroughly with all of our questions. This is the time when I thank all three of our speakers, Lacey Davidson of California Lutheran University, Vanessa Wills of George Washington University, and Charles Mills of the City University of the City of New York. Thank you to all three of them for three very, very interesting presentations. I also like each week to thank the administration team. These are the folks who work very hard each week to make sure that we can have these events every week. They are Kat St. Croix, Jenny Saul, Brandon Feitelson, Rima Basu, Mark Walker, Breno Santos, Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke, Chloe Wall, who, by the way, I just read on Facebook, successfully defended her PhD yesterday, so congratulations to Chloe Wall, Dennis Whitcomb, Dan Singer, Katharina Bernhardt, and Nicholas Nicola. Thank you, one and all. I've mentioned before, but we always have coffee hour after the event. I have put that in the chat box. For those of you who need to get the URL, please look at chat, pick up that URL now. That will be opening in about 5 minutes. I especially extend an invitation to our three speakers if you can do it. We understand that you're very busy, but if you can do it and come to the coffee hour and anyone has questions they want to follow up with you on, they can do it there. Without further ado, I want to say how great it was to spend this June 19th, Juneteenth with all of you. And I look forward to seeing all of you at future events from our social distance epistemology series. So thank you one and all, and I will see some of you at the coffee hour.